economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now,
Nick Pitts.
And welcome to Point of View on this March 28, 2018 day. I am Nick Pitts, your host for Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable discussion today. And we are so excited you decided to join us today for this second hour for those that are in the Dallas market, and then the first hour for those that are in a couple of the other markets, I guess you could say. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Mr. Kerby Anderson, the man, the myth, the legend. Kerby, how are you?
Always good, and we've got some very interesting things to talk about over the next couple hours.
Quite a few interesting things to talk about. And then we've also got Dr. Brent Taylor, pastor at Church of the Fields here in Carrollton, Texas. Pastor Brent, how are you?
Doing well. It's a great day.
The good Reverend Doctor, so good to have you here. And we've also, during this first hour, we've got a special guest that's over the phone with us today. We've got Mark Joseph on the line. Mark is a multimedia producer, author, founder of MJM Entertainment Group. From 2000 to 2005, he worked in development and marketing for Walden Media and Crusader Entertainment and oversaw a 9-member marketing team. But for our purposes, he is the author of the newly released book, Rock Gets Religion. And so he's going to be sharing a little bit about with that book, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So, Mark, are you there? Mark, you there? I guess not. And so
I am. Thank you guys for having me. It's great to be with you all.
Hey, Mark, great to have you here. Great to have you here. So glad you were here, and we're so excited about your book. So tell our audience a little bit about this book.
Well, this started for me about 25 years ago. I'm feeling very old, but I'm not that old. But I began, as a record producer, I began to interact with a lot of contemporary Christian music artists. And as I did, I would release their records overseas. And I would release them in the Asian market as though they were normal records. In other words, I would not use the contemporary Christian or Christian rock labeling, and had great success, overseas, kind of as the artist being treated without the hyphen, sort of Christian music. And as I began to interact with them, some of them would say, well, why can't we be treated the same way here in the U.S.? Why are we off in a separate section in what were then record stores, which limits access to non-believers? And so that began an odyssey and a journey for me of writing. This is the third and final book in a series, and really exploring why it is that we created this separate subculture, which is often removed from the mainstream world. And that began a series of articles for places like World Magazine and Billboard, and different places. And then the first book in 99 called The Rock and Roll Rebellion, Why People of Faith Abandoned Rock Music and Why They're Coming Back. A second one in 2003 called Faith, God, and Rock and Roll. And then this is the final, as you said, Rock Gets Religion. The subtitle is The Battle for the Soul of the Devil's Music. And the idea is there has been this sort of 50-plus year struggle of what is rock and roll. Is it intrinsically is it the devil's music? And how can people of faith interact with it and utilize it and try to do that in the mainstream places where normal non-believers congregate?
Mark, one of the things we've been talking about the last couple of weeks was, of course, because of the film, I Can Only Imagine. But, of course, you mentioned that in your book, but also that at one time was both a number one charts in the Christian realm and the, if you will, the country realm. So there have been some times when you've had, and you talk about in the book, some, if you will, breakout songs or other various kinds of events that didn't just get pigeonholed into the gospel category or the Christian contemporary category. True?
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I know you guys have a strong listener base in Dallas, Texas. And it is true. However, it is not. It was not intended to be a hit song in the mainstream world. Let me put it that way. That song was released by a CCM band, Mercy Me, into the Christian market, and there was no plan to take it into the mainstream. I credit the entire Mercy Me music and film phenomenon, and I'm just going to, I'm a film producer, so I like to create characters. I credit it to one housewife in Dallas, Texas, driving her minivan, who may be listening right now. And that mom, symbolizing many others, began to call their mainstream radio stations there in Dallas. I forgot what the name of the station was, and began to pester them, saying, could you please play this beautiful song called I Can Only Imagine? And so she mucked up the system. She wasn't supposed to do that. She was supposed to stay in her lane.
Yeah, supposed to stay in your lane.
Like radio. Absolutely. Stay in your lane, get out of the mainstream, and stay in your lane. She didn't obey orders from headquarters of the Christian and secular establishments. And like a good Dallas lady would, she ignored them, and she said, no, I want to hear this song on my local secular radio station. And that happened over and over and over again until finally the program directors and the DJs said, fine, we'll play it. When they played it, the listeners exploded in reaction to it. So this is what happens when activist Christians refuse to stay sequestered in their little niche.
That's phenomenal. So tell our listener, I'm very interested. So being the millennial at the table, one of the things that I'm fascinated by, like similar to Joan Jett, I love rock and roll. Grew up on rock and roll. There is nothing I love more than a little Metallica growing up, and then there was a couple of other bands that I would listen to when I was not working out, but trying to work out, at least in a gym for wrestling practice, and grew up kind of on punk rock as well. And so I grew up. When I was at church, there was just this dichotomy that was painted that really was rock was something that if you had CDs, was something that you threw into a fire because you kind of decided that was untouchable, that there was no way that God could be in that. And then iPods, and you were highly encouraged not to scourge your iPod of such type of music. But now it seems to be you're making a case that there's the heartbeat, I guess you could say, reverberations of the divine that are even in a guitar riff, right?
Yeah, here's the thing with the origins of rock and religion in the 50s. They got off to a very bad start. They got off to a bad rocky relationship. And there were a lot of reasons for it. I have to say in the 60s in particular, I don't fault the pastors and many parents for really being suspicious of rock and roll because you always want to be on guard against new things and make sure they're okay. But, imagine being a parent in 1964 and 65 and 66, and you've got all these things coming at you at the same time. You have the pill, you have Vietnam, you have rock and roll, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, drugs. It's hard to make sense of this barrage of the senses. And hard for a parent and a religious leader to sort out, okay, what is good, what's not. And part of it, I think the mistake was just saying this is all the devil's music. And, I used to hear stories as a kid about crazy anecdotal stories like, somebody heard a rock and roll song and it reminded them of the jungle incantations back in Africa on the mission field, and it was conjuring up demonic spirits and stuff like that I don't think was very helpful overall in helping us process is this good or bad. But anyway, so we got off to this rocky start where, pastors are encouraging, first of all, they see what the rock and roll is doing to their people, that it's kind of, think of girls at a Beatles concert, throwing their clothes up there or whatever. It's kind of taking over their minds, and that becomes a scary thing. And so instead of, dealing with it, I remember reading about Francis Schaeffer, that he would go to L'Abri and he would take a Led Zeppelin album and dissect the lyrics for everybody there. I mean, that's an intelligent response, right, to new ideas.
So Mark, we're going to have to take one of those breaks, but when we come back, we'll continue talking to you about your phenomenal book, Rock Gets Religion. And so we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The box office success of the film I Can Only Imagine is one more illustration of the success of faith-based films. Obviously, some have done better than others. Not all of them have a Christian theme like this one, but they all do well. Movie Guide released its 2018 report to the entertainment industry that looked at the box office performance of films released in 2017. Films with very strong Christian content or content that had strong redemptive or moral themes did the best. The box office average of $57 million in receipts. By contrast, they found that films with very strong non-Christian content only had box office receipts of about $10 million, and those films with very strong secular humanist or atheist content did the worse. They only had $1 million in box office receipts. Ted Baer is the founder of Movie Guide and released his results at the annual Movie Guide Faith and Family Awards Gala. He noted that despite a couple of disturbing trends, 2017 was another big year for family movies and movies with faith and values. These family-friendly films are not only better for the culture, but they also do better financially. Of the top 10 films worldwide in 2017, a full 90% of them contain strong Christian, redemptive, biblical, or moral content. If these family-friendly films do much better financially, why don't more directors and producers make more family films and fewer films with gratuitous sex and violence? Unfortunately, they want the accolades from their peers about doing edgy films and art house films. This is all the more reason for Christians to go to films like I Can Only Imagine in order to send a signal to Hollywood that we want more faith-based films. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Affirm Films, Paul, Apostle of Christ, starring Jim Caviezel, rated PG-13, now playing. Information at paulmovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I am Nick Pitts, your host for the Point of View Millennial Roundtable today on March 28, 2018. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Kerby Anderson as well as Brent Taylor. And we have over the phone Mark Joseph, who is author of the new book, Rock Gets Religion. And Mark, I just have to tell you, I write a little daily email every morning, and I need you to know that I'm a huge fan of rock music and music in general. I just think it's very easy for people to connect with, and I think it's just one of those commonality points that regardless of your religious beliefs allows individuals to be able to come together. So know that I am a huge fan of this and have a multitude of questions, but there's a couple of other people that are here at the table that are chomping at the bit to ask you questions. So I'm going to yield to one of them.
All right.
So Brent, go ahead.
Hey, Mark, we're so glad you're with us today and grateful for the opportunity to talk to you about your book. So help the listener who's out there today trying to understand. You said this is kind of the third book in a trilogy. Can you kind of just highlight what the three books, the progression of the three books, and what kind of the basic premise is so that they can understand exactly what you're trying to communicate?
Sure thing. You know, the first book was really an exploration of how we got into this position. And I came across an interesting analogy that helped me tell the story, and that was the Negro baseball leagues. And as I began to research, why did we have to have a separate baseball league for African-American players back in the day? And I realized that it was not simply sort of racist, bad white people who were keeping black people out of Major League Baseball. It was actually the owners of the Negro baseball leagues who wanted the system to continue. They liked the fact that there were people that wanted blacks not to be in the majors because it gave them a league that they could make money and earn a living off of. And as I realized, I grew up hearing the kind of persecution stories of the secular world will not allow Christians to participate in the mainstream business because we want to talk about Jesus, and they don't want that. And of course, there is some truth to that. But I also found that there were Christians who were making a living off of keeping Christians from going into the mainstream music and film and television industries, and that they had there was a weird convergence of secular people who wanted to keep Christians out of the public square and Christians who were making a good living doing that. And so what I was really calling for was encouraging artists who are strong Christians to go into the mainstream. And, one of my motivations that has always haunted me, Ted Nugent, the famous rock star, was once asked about Phil Keaggy, who you and I and at this table probably know, but the secular world really isn't aware of Phil Keaggy. He just happens to be one of the top, if not the top, guitar players in the world that nobody's ever heard of. Ted Nugent said about Phil, whatever happened to that Phil Keaggy, he could have saved the world with his guitar. Now, theological problems of Phil Keaggy saving the world aside, something very interesting there, that whatever happened to Phil, well, he made one record with a band called Glass Harp, a secular band, and then he disappeared into the Christian music world. And so what happened was, in our zeal to make music for each other, we deprived the world of great and important voices like Phil, like Randy Stonehill, like Larry Norman, and hundreds of artists that the world never got to hear. And that's part of what the first book was about. The second and third are continuations of it and really documenting what has been happening in the last 10 years, which is a very, very strong presence of Christians who are making music in the mainstream world now.
So, Mark, you talk about the influence and how Christians seem to step away from roles and places that they could have been. When you look back over music history from you take kind of the long view, you see that, a few hundred years ago, it was Christians who were influencing and kind of setting the standard for what music was going to be and what people were participating in, obviously largely through the church. And then in recent years, I think we've seen Christian music oftentimes seems to be an echo of what's happening in the secular world, where if you find, during the boy band era, then you had kind of the Christian version of that, or you had the Christian version of the pop singer, whoever it may be. Is that what you're trying to encourage Christians to understand and let Christians be leaders in that field? Is that what you're saying?
Sure. You remember when we were all in school and our friends would say cafeteria food sucks. I used to think, no, it doesn't necessarily. Sometimes it's really good. I was that weird kid. Well,
you can say that again. No, I'm just kidding.
Right. Mondays and Tuesdays were okay. But I grew up in a similar way. My friends would say, well, Christian music is horrible. It's a derivative. And as I began to really meet these artists, what I learned was not necessarily so at all. They were simply not given the opportunities that mainstream artists were given. And so it wasn't that this is the farm team that wasn't quite good enough to cut it. In fact, in my book, I talk about how Keith Green, before he became a Christian music pop star, he was somewhat of a child prodigy in the secular world before he became a Christian. And so, Keith Green didn't become a Christian pop star because he couldn't cut it in the real. He had already made it. As a 10-year-old, he was the youngest songwriter ever signed to ASCAP as a songwriter. And so it just wasn't the case. Now, the difference is that mainstream artists were given unlimited budgets. They were given a lot of creative control. And so they could make great records, whereas often artists in the Christian world were constrained by minuscule budgets, by people who would guide them to make music that was a little bit more derivative and boring and more geared towards certain audiences and weren't allowed to be as creative as they would like to be. So I've never really bought into the idea that Christian artists are substandard. But I'll give you an example. Joy Williams had, I think, 3 records in the Christian market. Some of your audience may remember her as a Christian pop star.
Sure.
She then crossed over and started a band called the Civil Wars. Now, the Civil Wars has been lauded as one of the most amazing, groups of this decade. NPR and PBS and your secular Volvo-driving listeners love this band. Well, it's the same Joy Williams. She's just been allowed to be more creative and make a record without A&R directors, looking over her shoulder and making sure she says this word and that word, but it's the same person. So the talent has always been there. It's a matter of were we allowing them to be creative, and were we creating pathways for these artists into the mainstream world?
Yeah, that's fascinating because you talk about the Civil Wars, and that's a great example because Barton Hollow was a phenomenal album that came out in 2011. I loved it, and I really didn't even know that Joy Williams was in the Christian world. It seems as though you're advocating for a position that it seems like the Christian world is kind of like minor league baseball to a certain degree. And it's fascinating the way that you put it is that it's really kind of two things. It's not necessarily that it's a lower standard of music, but really individuals stand to gain by continuing to keep a Christian market, right? So there's just certain individuals that are monetarily will gain, influence will gain by continuing to kind of create this kind of smaller market. And then two, there's not opportunities for them to be able to cross over into the larger market. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. And look, there's no problem with having outlets that are geared toward a certain type of person, Christian radio. There's no issue with that. It's really more about are we doing things that intentionally block our people from going into the larger world as well. For instance, just to give you an example, my book, in a funny way, my book was top 10 at Amazon in both the Christian music book section and the rock section. And so my book could travel freely. It wasn't being kept out by the way my publishing company marketed or anything. So my book is free to roam, if you will. But the problem was oftentimes we would not give that with artists. And, back in the day when there were LPs and CDs, we would have, record stores. I know this sounds quaint to some of you who are under the age of 30. But one way that we would keep people literally away from the artists was the way that a record was categorized in those stores.
Yeah.
And I remember that Jars of Clay, a band that I worked with, they would actually call Walmart, their management, and say, hey, could you please put us in the J section, where the J's are, Jars of Clay. And the record label would call Walmart and say, please put them in the gospel section of that store. And so you literally have a clear example where we're choosing, frankly, selling stuff to each other over the opportunity for a non-Christian person who's browsing in that store to come across it in their normal course of events. I have a band called POD that I worked with, and they would often, very, very strong believers, they would often go on tours like Ozfest with Ozzy Osbourne. Well, they would tell stories of listeners who would see them at that show, go to the record store, couldn't find them, only to be told they're in the gospel section somewhere past the Gaithers. Well, imagine that kid with a nose ring is just not going to be purchasing.
Yeah, POD singing "Here Comes the Boom," and I got to say, "Here Comes the Break." But nevertheless, we're gonna have you back. We got to take one of those commercial breaks, and so we'd love to hear from you. 800-351-1212. We're gonna have Mark Joseph on right after the break. So POD's going boom. We're going break. We'll be back right after this.
From Affirm Films, the studio that brought you Risen and War Room, comes Paul, Apostle of Christ. Two men challenged an empire in order to live out the gospel of Jesus Christ and spread their message to the world.
Where sin abounds, grace abounds more.
Starring Jim Caviezel. Paul, Apostle of Christ. Rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. Now playing. More information is available at paulmovie.com.
Few of us get the chance to really make a difference, but today you have an opportunity. The question is whether you will seize it. Becoming a Truth Team partner with Point of View magnifies your impact in this generation and perhaps for many to come. When you stop what you're doing and call us or give online, you invest in hard work that has changed lives and communities for 45 years. Grab this opportunity. Call 800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net/team. Don't let this opportunity pass by. Join the team and make a difference. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View. I am Nick Pitts, your host for the Millennial Roundtable of this Point of View on this Wednesday, March 28th day, 2018, which just happens to be Reba McEntire's birthday. And since we're talking about music, we've got Roots, Rock Gets Religion author Mark Joseph on the phone with us. And we've also got in studio Kerby Anderson as well as Brent Taylor. We've been talking to Mark for the past 30 minutes of this first hour, talking about the idea of just these two things that almost seem like oil and water to some people, this rock and religion. And we were talking earlier about we left off in the break the PODs of really having an ability to be able to cross over those rock bands that were really that had a Christian message, the Southtowns and the Booms and the Alive, those hits that they had, but also appealed to a larger audience. And when we think about it today, Mark, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts, because there's Christians that now appear to be more prevalent to a certain degree in kind of the mainstream, I guess we would say, of the music industry. So you think about Chance the Rapper, who performed at the Grammys with Kirk Franklin. You think about the Kendrick Lamars. But then for some of our audience, when they hear that, it's very immediately they hear certain language that they wouldn't expect to be coming from Christian artists. And so help us to better understand that to a large degree.
Yes. And this is when I talk about the return of strong Christians and not so strong Christians into the mainstream music world. It's not a clean story where everybody is doing the right thing. It's a messy story, right? Because for every Switchfoot, there's a Katy Perry, there's a Miley Cyrus. And these stories, if you or I were Katy or Miley's dad, we would not be happy with the way things have turned out, with their daughters crossing over into the mainstream music business. It's a very dangerous place, and there are going to be casualties in this process. But, at the same time, there are a lot of other good stories. And I think you're talking about some of the rappers who, come from very difficult backgrounds and use very, very salty language, and Chance the Rapper, Kendrick Lamar. But there's also, artists like Lecrae, who is fairly well theologically grounded and has good people in his life. But I think overall, Alice Cooper is probably the best example of the change that's happened. It's going to be surprising to some of your listeners that on the Van Halen 3 record, the theologian R.C. Sproul is thanked. And Alice Cooper was mentored by R.C. Sproul. And so it really is the quality of the leadership they have in their lives. And when artists have that kind of pastoral care, then you have a different kind of an outcome. When artists are untethered from any kind of that kind of guidance, then you have a different outcome. So it really depends. But I don't want to paint a rosy picture of, isn't it wonderful, everybody's singing Kumbaya. There are great stories and not so great examples of this.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And so we're going to continue to open up the phone lines. You can call in and ask Mark a question, 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. Or for our Facebook audience, you can, as you're looking at me right now, as I'm staring deeply into the camera, you can leave a little comment or message in that live video feed right there underneath, and then we'll be able to share that, what you shared over online. But we're going to jump over to the phone lines. We've got Roy right now. Roy in New Hampshire. Roy, are you there?
Hey, gentlemen, how you doing?
Hey.
I just wanted to make a comment that there was a quote supposedly by Jimi Hendrix that said that he said that Phil Kaye was better than him as far as being a guitarist. And a few years ago, an artist that I think we as Christians really underappreciated was Roby Duke. Roby Duke made one of the prettiest songs, "Oh Magnify the Lord," that really is beautiful, man. Because I tend to lean more towards the jazz side of music and the jazz genre, and it's one of the prettiest songs that I don't think a lot of Christians even ever heard. "Oh Magnify the Lord" by Roby Duke, but he's no longer with us. But man, it's beautiful.
Well, first of all, a couple of things. Great to hear from you, and I want to address Roby Duke because that's close to my heart. But Listen, I did try to track down that Jimi Hendrix quote. It just never happened. The closest I can get to it is the Ted Nugent quote. Hendrix was first of all, the archives of The Tonight Show are not available, and as far as I can tell, he was not on The Tonight Show when Carson was there. But anyway, it's a great thought, and I would say that Ted Nugent is more solid. As far as Roby Duke, it's funny, as I said earlier, Roby Duke was actually one of the artists that I released overseas. And that's a great example of an artist. I put out Come Let Us Reason, Down to Business, and one other one in the Japanese market. And so in Japan, Roby Duke is not known of as the Christian artist. He's the artist. He's that West Coast artist. Now, does that mean he's hiding the gospel? Of course not. His records are the same. They're actually translated into Japanese on the CD sleeve. But in Japan, he was able to have a career that reached beyond the Christian community. In the U.S., as you correctly stated, he's not known outside of the Christian community. And that's a great example. I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So let's continue taking phone calls. We've got Kay in Missouri right now. Kay, are you there?
Yes.
Hey.
I was just telling I'm old now. You got to remember I'm 70 years old. And when I was growing up, there were songs that they crossed over, in my opinion, and they were great songs, like A Bridge Over Troubled Water and these kind of songs. And they're great songs forever. And then there were some songs that had a really good, the beat caught you and everything. But one of them was I'm not scared of dying and I don't really care. I know there ain't no heaven and I pray there ain't no hell. When I started listening to what the words said, I don't want to listen to that. That's not true. So I quit listening to that song because I didn't like the lyrics and because they didn't help you. So there were a lot of rock and rolls. I even liked that one song the Beatles had, Lady Madonna, Children. I mean, it tells a story that you need to listen to because some life isn't always easy. So I think that we don't give the kids enough credit. Maybe there's a problem with this generation, but in our generation, you did listen to the song, you heard the words, and you decided what you were and were not going to listen to. And it didn't have to be Christian music, nor did it have to be rock and roll. I even liked, what's her name, the black singer that sang gospel. I loved it, Mahalia Jackson. I loved her music. So kids can have a variety, even though they're young, and enjoy all of it if you'll just let them be exposed to it. And my parents let us do that.
That's great. Thank you so much for calling, Kay. So about listening to music intelligently, it seems like what Kay was arguing for. Does that sound about right, Mark?
Yeah, and Kay, I think maybe you were in a different time when there was more of that going back and forth. But what happened in the 70s in particular, the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, and this is where, the secular world really was at fault in the way they handled this. But there were basically 5 to 10 primarily men in Hollywood. And, let me just say that to make it simple, they didn't share Kerby Anderson's view of the world, to keep it simple. And so these 5 to 10 men decided who became a pop or a rock star for all practical purposes. You may think you discovered the Eagles. You didn't. They were discovered for you by a couple of guys in Hollywood. And so who they chose to anoint to be the pop or rock star depended on who we got as our pop and rock stars. And I'll give you a clear example. In the book, I have the example of how Keith Green goes to audition for one of these men in New York in 1976. And he goes to New York. Remember, he's had this child prodigy career. He goes and wanting to expand, as a believer now, wanting to sing for the mainstream world, and he auditions for Clive Davis. Clive Davis turns him down, and so Keith Green is forced to go into Christian music because of that turn down. Now, what happens in the 90s and in the 2000s primarily that changes this paradigm is American Idol is a very important change in the way this operates. Why? Because suddenly Clive Davis or David Geffen's opinion doesn't matter. Now whose opinions matters is you and me, is you and I. It's Hank in Cleveland and Susie in Tuscaloosa because the American Idol phenomenon changes that, and people are actually voting for our pop and rock stars, not the gatekeepers. So Carrie Underwood, these are the kinds of artists who are believers, who are not being sidelined by the gatekeepers and are coming straight to us as pop and rock stars picked by the people.
I couldn't agree more. What we see is the popularization and kind of that mass populism, which we're seeing on a variety of different levels, right, Kerb?
Yeah, and I love this line here that Keith Green wrote in his journal. Clive Davis kept me waiting for almost 2 hours. It was a failure, but I took it so well I couldn't believe it. I kept telling myself that the Lord wanted me to do a Christian album. It depressed me, but I kept my chin up, So it's just a lot of great illustrations in the book, but I know we have to take a break.
Yeah, we're going to have to take a break, and so we'll continue taking your phone calls. You can call in at 800-351-1212. Again, that number's 800-351-1212. Or hop over on Facebook, facebook.com/pointofviewradio. Leave a little message underneath the live video feed, and we'll be able to get to that over air. But we'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. When the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit declined to review a decision of that court that said that the cross-shaped Bladensburg World War I Veterans Memorial is unconstitutional, not all the judges agreed. Chief Judge Gregory noted his dissent. He said, quote, nearly a century ago, Maryland citizens, out of deep respect and gratitude, took on the daunting task of erecting a monument to mirror the measure of individual devotion and sacrifice these heroes had so nobly advanced. The panel majority says their effort violates the Constitution the soldiers fought to defend. I, respectfully, think otherwise. Judge Niemeyer said with some exasperation, quote, until this action was filed by persons who claimed to be offended by the presence of the monument, no complaint had been made about its presence, unquote. But Judge Wilkinson was poetic in his dissent. He wrote, quote, the dead cannot speak for themselves, but may the living hear their silence. This memorial and this cross have stood for almost 1 full century. Life and change flow by the small park in the form of impatient cars and trucks. That is disturbance enough, unquote. He concluded simply noting that the park in which the memorial stands, quote, may not be Arlington National Cemetery, but it is the next thing to it. I would let the cross remain and let those honored rest in peace, unquote. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I am Nick Pitts, your host for the Point of View Millennial Roundtable today. I've got Brent Taylor, pastor of Church on the Fields, and then also Kerby Anderson joining me at the Millennial Roundtable today. And we've got over the phone today, we have the author of Rock Gets Religion, Mark Joseph. And so we are so excited. He's been sharing with us a little bit about the relationship between rock and religion. And it's been fascinating to talk about how we have this dichotomy that's been kind of put between the two. And we were talking about everything from POD to Jars of Clay to even Carrie Underwood.
And Joy Williams.
And Joy Williams.
That's a great story.
Of the Civil Wars. Yeah. And so to say the least, I'm going to let Jesus take the wheel, but specifically Kathy take the mic right now as we're going to continue taking phone calls. Kathy, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey, Kathy, what is your point of view?
Well, I've always been a heavy metal fan, actually, and sort of had a conflict there, but I was always a big fan of U2, and then somebody pointed out to me that they were an extremely faith, had a deep faith. I think they've departed from that in later years, but as they become more popular. But early on, particularly they have a song called 40 that is based on the 40th Psalm. It's a beautiful song, and as I began to listen to their early stuff, I realized a lot of it is very spiritual. I've been to a lot of their concerts where it's practically a religious experience, the most peaceful and loving environment you'd ever want to be in. So I just didn't know if you'd even mentioned U2, but like I say, seems like a lot of times everyone starts out with good intentions and then get led astray by the popularity and the pressure of what the public wants, Whereas, you're right, the public really doesn't want that, but the powers that be want that. And I think the powers that be don't want the same thing that your basic, quiet American wants.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. So, Mark, what say you about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a weird phenomenon that goes on. But before I talk about that, I want to talk about U2 and your being a heavy metal fan. Yeah, U2, it's important to remember that U2 are European Christians. And so they're going to be a little bit different culturally than American Christians on social issues, on different things. But in their own context, I think you have to understand that in their context, I would consider them sort of faithful Christians in that context. As far as the metal crowd, Alice Cooper wrote the foreword to this book for me, and he talks about the heavy metal crowd are the ones who are crying out to God the loudest. And there has been satanic imagery in heavy metal music, but there's also been a lot of crying out to God. And if you get a chance to read the foreword, please do. It's a beautiful foreword. But I would say in the metal world especially, Dave Mustaine of Megadeth gave me a blurb for the book. He's been a devout believer in more recent years. And as far as Alice is important because there's been a change in thinking. You mentioned U2 and also Elvis. U2 and Elvis were really counseled by their early pastors. Hey, I don't know if you should do this. This might be in conflict with your faith. And so you ended up, in the case of Elvis, with a very tortured soul. His pastor told him you've got to choose between God and rock and roll. Well, Alice Cooper's pastor is a different kind of animal. Alice comes back. He was raised in the church. He comes back to his faith after years of alcoholism and debauchery, and he becomes a very strong Christian. And he goes to his pastor there in Arizona, and he says, what do I do now, basically? Now, remember, in previous years, a pastor would likely have counseled Alice, I want you to cut your hair, go back to your given name of Vincent Fournier, take off the makeup, and I'd like you to tour the country and record for Word Records and sing hymns. So if you can imagine Alice Cooper singing Amazing Grace in his voice, as Vincent Fournier, that's what would have happened. Now, what would have happened to all of his fans? They obviously wouldn't have gone along for that ride. They would have said, oh, isn't that nice? Alice has a new thing. Well, we're going back to another artist. But Alice's pastor says to him, does God make mistakes? Alice presumably says, I don't think so. He says, well, he made you to be Alice Cooper. Go out there and be a transformed Alice Cooper, but still be Alice Cooper. Be an Alice Cooper whose lyrics are informed by a biblical worldview. And so that's what you've seen happen. And I would say for your listeners out there, if you pick up an album called The Last Temptation, this is the first record in Alice's post-conversion, or first or second, very, very strong worldview about Christ, about faith. And he says, what about faith? What about Christ? What about faith in God above in one of the songs? That's the kind of transformation you've seen today.
That's fascinating because it really does. It illuminates kind of that dichotomy that I always go back to that for our listeners, this idea from Faith in the Halls of Power. You've got Michael Lindsay that really does paint these two categories of Christians. You've got the populist Christians and you've got the cosmopolitan Christians. Populist Christians probably more geared towards listening to the Christian music stations, the KLTYs, going to revivals, and nothing wrong with that whatsoever. A lot of good things that happen because of that. And then there's the cosmopolitan Christians that are more attuned to kind of what we would consider the secular world. You've got the art gallery openings. You've got fine wine. You've got other things that they're finding God in some of those things that the populist Christians would consider outside the bounds. And it seems like what you're saying is kind of Alice Cooper had one of those William Wilberforce, John Newton moments where, no, I don't need to join the ministry. I just need to be a faithful witness in the midst of being in the House of, I believe, House of Lords, or no, House of Members, or something. Commons, that's right. And so that's a fascinating little compare and contrast.
Again, I would encourage people to read the foreword because he starts out by saying, this is Alice Cooper. Personally, I don't believe in atheists. I think God's imprint is in our DNA, in our hearts, and our souls. We are a tribe of disobedient children. A little bit later, he talks about, as a Christian, knowing what they know, and he's talking about some of these different groups that he's mentioned. I ask if they can buy into what the artist is selling. Everyone is preaching something. And that's something that we always talk about, Nick, on the program here, is you really need to evaluate whether you're reading an article on the internet, whether you're opening up a newspaper, whether you're watching a television program. Certainly when you're going to movies, when you're listening to music, you need to be saying what's being said and is it true and what of it, and how to really begin to evaluate that and have some discernment.
Yeah, you need to have a filter is probably the best thing that you could have, recognizing the kind of what you put before your eyes. It just has a very significant, and what you allow your ears to listen to, very significant weight in the biblical narrative from Mark 4:24 and 25, as well as just what Jesus continues to point to us, or rather through Paul in Philippians 4:8 and 9, whatever's pure, whatever's holy, whatever's noble, whatever's good, whatever's true. Think about such things and practice such things. That's not necessarily all Christian things that you might be able to see, but finding Christ in the midst of things. Kind of going back to that idea that we talked about in the first hour of C.S. Lewis. Not necessarily, I don't believe in the sun because I can see it, but rather because it illuminates everything else. That we can see echoes or hear echoes of the divine, even in the Alice Coopers of the world, even in the Derek Webbs of the world, even in the YouTubes of the world that aren't necessarily explicitly talking about Christ. And I think that's what Rock Gets Religion points to. So Mark, thanks so much for joining us today. But tell our audience where they might be able to grab your book or maybe find out more information on it.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. And yes, it's available at Christian retail proudly and mainstream retail, of course, online as well. And I'd love to connect with your listeners at my page, markjoseph.com, or the Facebook page, any questions they might have. But it was just great to hear your listeners are so engaged, and even the questions that came in about Roby Duke and other things. It's just it's great to see that your audience is really keeping up with all of these trends.
That's phenomenal. Well, Mark, thanks so much for joining us. We're so grateful for your book, and we're so grateful that you decided to join us today. And we're going to have to take one of those breaks. And so when we get back, we're going to jump back into the news. Will be everything from the census that appears to be heading towards putting in a question in the census in 2020 of, are you a citizen of the United States, the citizenship question. And so we'll be talking about that. What's the Christian response to that, as well as talking about 51% of church-going Americans don't know the Great Commission, as well as 10,000 salvations based on Billy Graham's death. We'll be talking about that and more. And so you can join in on the conversation too. Call in at 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. Or jump over on Facebook, facebook.com/pointofviewradio. Leave a little comment or message right underneath this live box, and we'll get back to it right after this.
From Affirm Films, the studio that brought you Risen and War Room, comes Paul, Apostle of Christ. Two men challenged an empire in order to live out the gospel of Jesus Christ and spread their message to the world.
Where sin abounds, grace abounds more.
Starring Jim Caviezel. Paul, Apostle of Christ. Rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. Now playing. More information is available at paulmovie.com.
Few of us get the chance to really make a difference, but today you have an opportunity. The question is whether you will seize it. Becoming a Truth Team partner with Point of View magnifies your impact in this generation and perhaps for many to come. When you stop what you're doing and call us or give online, you invest in hard work that has changed lives and communities for 45 years. Grab this opportunity. Call 800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net/team. Don't let this opportunity pass by. Join the team and make a difference. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now,
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View for this third hour on this March 28th, 2018 day. I am Nick Pitts, your host for the Point of View Millennial Roundtable on this glorious day that we celebrate Reba McEntire's birthday. Did you know that, Kirby?
I did not know that.
Miss Fancy. Miss Fancy.
It's my son's birthday and Reba McEntire's birthday.
I thought you were going to talk about Sweet Jesus ice cream or something. There's ice cream day or something like that.
Sweet Jesus ice cream. We'll be talking about that during the hour as well. And so we have got, if you've been following with us for 3 hours, we're going to need you to call in so we can be sure to send you some type of gift for having to put up with me during this long little stretch. And so during the first hour, we talked about everything from the fact that 51% of church-going Americans do not know the Great Commission, and which was just staggering statistics. 54% of British Christians believe that the Hunger Games is in the biblical narrative, and 34% believe that Harry Potter is in the biblical narrative. Just highlighting the biblical illiteracy that's kind of scattered across Christendom right now. And then we also just had over the phone Mark Joseph, Rock Gets Religion, and you can find that on our website, pointofview.net, to connect more with him, and want to direct you to the website so that you can hear that fascinating interview as we explored the relationship between rock and religion in this grand American experiment, and ever since the kind of the formation of that in the early 20th century. And here in the third hour, we're going to be talking about everything from the census to even right now, sweet baby Jesus. And so there was a fascinating article that's kind of circulating the wires today. It's Christians are giving and putting up a protest towards sweet Jesus ice cream because of the branding that's happening. And so there is a Toronto-based chain that is making its way into Baltimore, Maryland. It's known as Sweet Jesus, which is a type of ice cream. And what's happened is that their branding is kind of, I guess you would say, agitating some Christians, to say the least. There's the upside down cross that's on the branding. They feel as though they're taking the Lord's name in vain, which seems pretty obvious relative to the branding. And then also some of the graphics are saying that they're reminiscent of satanic metal rock bands, which is, I guess, just bleeds, kind of is a nice little transition from Rock Gets Religion to a certain degree. And so there's individuals, especially those that are the authors of the petition, and it says specifically in the petition, this is a mockery of taking the Lord's name in vain and also highly offensive to Christians. The petition says, and the petition added that the imagery was used to promote the brand is anti-Christian. And so, Brent, being the sweet tooth connoisseur that you are with donuts and the pastor here in the studio, help us make sense of the protest going on with Sweet Jesus ice cream.
Well, I'm a Bluebell guy myself, so
we saw on Instagram.
Yes, we all did see that. You and
flavor.
Andrew seem to like that same flavor.
Yes,
you might explain which one that is.
Well, it is a chocolate peanut butter cookie dough, and I'm not a cookie dough kind of guy as much, but I am a chocolate peanut butter kind of guy.
Sounds like the beautiful triad:
well,
chocolate, peanut butter, and cookie dough.
Yes, and it is. It's hard to go wrong with Bluebell. So you cannot go wrong with Bluebell. It's probably a better way to say that.
Bluebell is wrong, I don't want to be
That's
right.
exactly
or
right.
Skinny. But keep on.
Well, it's interesting because this company is. It seems a little bit like when you look at it that they're trying to thread the needle there. They're trying to say, on the one hand, well, we didn't intend any harm by this.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, they also believe that this is probably pretty good publicity for their dessert. They're saying that they have a wide range of cultural beliefs and religious beliefs in their organization. They're not trying to make any commentary on it at all. Yet I have to say, I'm just a little tired of. It seems like Jesus gets attacked in a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And while I'm not one that's always about protesting and in terms of boycotts, I'm not a big fan of those necessarily in every situation. I do see a time, I'm troubled. Let me say it that way. I'm troubled by the way that the name of Jesus is so easily thrown around in our culture. And when you see the ads are designed to obviously be something that fires people up a little bit and gets a little attention there. So I'm a big fan of ice cream. I'm not a big fan of putting Jesus into the name there and trying to do the upside down cross, things like that, where they're obviously from a marketing perspective trying to build on that. I think the name of Jesus is something as believers we should hold high, we should revere, we should respect. And I'm not sure that other religions would put up with being mocked like this.
Yeah, that's the thing I was going to point to, Kerby, and put you on the spot for it. Like if this was a different religion, say Islam, or it would seem as though there would be much more of an uproar that's happening about this. And right now, it doesn't seem like there's too much of an uproar relative to kind of some of the other outlets that could potentially be talking about this.
Yeah, and if people find that article, one of the statements is, God forbid the name of the Prophet Muhammad was used in this manner, or the name of Allah against Muslims. And so there are, at least two issues. Issue number one is people can make their choice about buying a product or not buying a product based on whether they like whether the ice cream is good or not, or whether they like the branding or not. So again, we live in a free country and people can make those choices. But a bigger issue in the one that I think Brent raises is, what causes people to sit in a room and say, okay, we want to get some attention for our ice cream, and one of the ways I know we can break out from the cacophony of noise and various kinds of images is, let's see if we can just kind of poke the nose or poke the eye of any Christian by calling it Sweet Jesus. And then, and this is going to really work well for us because people that have any kind of Christian convictions are just going to flock to this, even though we've actually offended them. And I do not understand the mindset of individuals sitting in a room trying to come up with a marketing strategy that is based upon that. But nevertheless, that's what they're trying to do, apparently.
And we'd love to hear from you, 800-351-1212. Again, that number's 800-351-1212. Or if you're on Facebook, facebook.com/pointofviewradio, leave a little comment right underneath there, and we'll be sure to get that comment over air. And maybe it's just me, maybe it's just my millennial perspective. I think that I hear you, Brent, to a certain degree, that it just seems as though individuals are just poking at Christians because we kind of have the Ned Flanders effect, right? We're just going to be de-doodly nice and not necessarily do anything else in return. And so there's a part of me that's frustrated just because I'm hyper competitive and I don't want to be picked on. But then there's also another part of me that just recognizes, you know what? At the end of the day, we might be offended, but God won't be mocked. And I'm just saddened at the fact that these individuals feel as though they're willing to lose their soul in order to gain the ice cream world.
That may be one of the worst translations of Scripture I've heard in a long time. But at the same time, I mean, I understand what you're saying. I just think, though, my issue is not about whether or not, I don't think Christians necessarily need to go and fight these battles. There are more important battles to be fought. There are more important issues to be won. The most disturbing thing that we've heard today is not that people are upset about an ice cream brand. The most disturbing thing we've heard today is that so few Christians know what the Great Commission is. That's the more disturbing topic that we've talked about today. But I do think, though, there is an element by which that people feel like that Christianity is it's okay to poke fun, to make fun of the Christian faith. Should we have broad shoulders? Yes. Should we have thick skin? Absolutely. We should have all those things. But at the same time, we should also be willing to stand up and say, hey, you don't talk that way. I don't let people talk that way about my family. I don't let people talk that way about my mom. Why would I let them talk that way about my Lord?
And we'll continue that talk right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The box office success of the film I Can Only Imagine is one more illustration of the success of faith-based films. Obviously, some have done better than others. Not all of them have a Christian theme like this one, but they all do well. Movie Guide released its 2018 report to the entertainment industry that looked at the box office performance of films released in 2017. Films with very strong Christian content or content that had strong redemptive or moral themes did the best. The box office average of $57 million in receipts. By contrast, they found that films with very strong non-Christian content only had box office receipts of about $10 million, and those films with very strong secular humanist or atheist content did the worse. They only had $1 million in box office receipts. Ted Baer is the founder of Movie Guide and released his results at the annual Movie Guide Faith and Family Awards Gala. He noted that despite a couple of disturbing trends, 2017 was another big year for family movies and movies with faith and values. These family-friendly films are not only better for the culture, but they also do better financially. Of the top 10 films worldwide in 2017, a full 90% of them contained strong Christian, redemptive, biblical, or moral content. If these family-friendly films do much better financially, why don't more directors and producers make more family films and fewer films with gratuitous sex and violence? Unfortunately, they want the accolades from their peers about doing edgy films and art house films. This is all the more reason for Christians to go to films like I Can Only Imagine in order to send a signal to Hollywood that we want more faith-based films. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Affirm Films, Paul, Apostle of Christ, starring Jim Caviezel, rated PG-13, now playing. Information at paulmovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we are back on Point of View, and we have been talking about ice cream.
Oh,
you
dear.
scream,
You're
we
making me
all
hungry.
scream for ice cream over the break and during that first segment of the third hour. And we've been talking about Sweet Jesus Ice Cream, Toronto-based company that now is making its way towards the land of 10,000 lakes of Minnesota in the Mall of America. And some Christians, at least, are making a big fuss about it or putting up a protest about it, feeling as though it's sacrilegious to some, it's blasphemy to others, just saying it's taking the Lord's name in vain. And during the break, we were talking about it. Brent and I were kind of going back and forth on it because, Brent, tell when you hear the Lord's name in vain, it's becoming very prevalent today to a large degree. This isn't just an ice cream issue. This is an everybody screaming issue, right?
Well, it is. I think the bigger problem is the Mall of America. I've been there, and having to walk around that place.
You don't like Busch Gardens.
Was suffering. Yes. You know, it's an age issue, I guess, but I think it's more than that. You know, I was raised with a lot of respect in my home, just how the family life was, and so that's the culture that's my background. But also, I was raised in the church. I was raised in a minister's home. So that has defined who I am. It's part of my DNA. It's part of how I live my life. And I just have to say, I get very uncomfortable with the way that the name of Jesus is thrown around. You know, obviously you make reference to 10 Commandments, and you can think about how we say the name of Jesus. But to me, when I see something like Sweet Jesus Ice Cream, I do not necessarily say to myself, I must go boycott that. Because like I said, I'm not really into boycotts. It's not really my thing. But I will say it makes me uncomfortable when I hear the name of Jesus get used in that way. And I see it happen a lot in our culture today, especially in a younger crowd. References to, you know, praying to Jesus from Talladega Nights from the movie. And and 6 pound, 8 ounce baby Jesus. There is something inside of me that just is very uncomfortable with that. And it's something that maybe millennials don't quite understand because they were raised in a culture where that wasn't as big a thing. But maybe it's just my upbringing, my background, my age. But those kind of things make me just a little jittery on the inside, and they trouble me on the inside. And I have to be honest with you. I'm okay being troubled with it on the inside. I'm okay with it bothering me on the inside. I'm not out on some crusade about that, but I am bothered by it.
Kerby, can you speak to that? Because I think he brings up a great point that there is a certain prevalence, kind of what some would consider taking the Lord's name in vain. We see it in movies such as Talladega Nights. We see it in this ice cream company. We even see it like within emojis to a large degree. There's
I was saying OMG. So. There you go. Yeah.
Does that trouble you? Is that something that changes your temperament on the inside, or is it just kind of so prevalent now that because for me it's become so prevalent now that I'm just kind of numb to it. It's not that I'm not bothered by it when I become cognizant of it. I'm just doesn't do anything to me.
I'm judging you right now.
I know you are, Miley.
and I think we are getting kind of numb to it. And I'd love to get a comment or two from our callers because, first of all, are you bothered by that? You go to a movie and you think it's going to be pretty good, and after about the third or fourth time you heard profanity. It's not like I haven't heard it before, but you just go, okay, we're going to have to go and sit through this. How much longer? We all know that we've been on a television, watch a TV show, and your spouse is there. At least two of us are married, and we just go, and she's looking at you like, okay, we're going to turn this off. And I go, yeah, I guess we're going to have to turn this off because you just, after a while, yes, you're numb to it, but also you just get weary of it as well. Mm-hmm. And I'd love to know from our listeners, are there places where maybe it's time to draw a line and just simply say, look, because of that profanity, because of that attack on Christianity, because of that ridiculing our Lord, is that something that you finally say, I'm going to draw a line here? I may not boycott it, but I'm not going to put any more money on it. I'm not going to watch that particular program. Because there are TV shows that I used to watch that I don't watch anymore. Late night programs, hardly anymore, because they're going to just, vilify whoever is out there and make fun of people that I know and get, tired of it. So there is a sense in which you're right. We've become numb to it. We hear it, but after a while, I think there's a point at which we need to draw the line. And I would love to know from our listeners, where do you draw the line? Maybe we aren't going to boycott sweet Jesus, but we certainly aren't going to buy it either. And that's something to be thinking about in terms of how you're going to spend your consumer dollars or how you're going to spend your time.
Yeah, so you can call in 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. Or jump on over to Facebook.com/PointOfViewRadio. Right underneath there, put a little comment, a little question in it, and then we'll share it online or over the air. Again, does the name of God being taken in vain, kind of being uttered, I guess I would say, does that bother you? Does it do something to you? 800-351-1212. And so we're going to jump over on the phone calls right now. We've got Kat right now. Kat, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hey, Kat, what's your point of view?
My point of view is I was wondering, since we've got a vice president who is a Christian in office, if there was any way that maybe across the United States, either at a local level with our ordinances or the state level with your statutes and the federal level with acts or laws, if there could be a movement put forward to get an act or a law or an ordinance or a statute that provides protection for the Religious Protection Act or Religious Protection Ordinance or law, so that we can protect the religious expression of our creativity in our businesses, so that people like these cake bakers are protected and they don't lose their business and their life income that they've worked so hard for, but that it would be a Religious Protection Act that would cover those areas and protect people who want to express their creativity through what their religious beliefs are, so they can't be taken out of business. That's what my question is.
Yesterday we had Michael Ferris on, and of course he is the individual that last Tuesday argued the case for the pregnancy centers before the Supreme Court. And, of course, that case, which is an ADF case, of course, their other case, which is, of course, Jack Phillips, who is the baker in Colorado. And I think it's interesting because the individual that actually put together the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is the individual we had on yesterday, Michael Ferris. And one of the individuals that tried to actually implement that at the statewide level is now our Vice President, Mike Pence, who was vilified for actually presenting that. And this Religious Freedom Restoration Act back in the 1990s was something that Chuck Schumer and Ted Kennedy endorsed, but it just shows how the culture has changed, and it's getting more and more difficult to protect the rights of religious people that believe in religious freedom, in large part because it always is portrayed as being anti-LGBT. And so that's kind of the difficulty we have right now in trying to pass any ordinance at the state level or at the local level. When we have a national Religious Freedom Restoration Act, you try to implement that at your state, and you're considered a bigot. So it shows how much the culture has changed.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Kind of, I guess, indications are either in late May or early June when we'll hear the ruling that comes down for the Masterpiece Cake, and so we will see. And so let's continue jumping over on some phone calls. We've got Bob right now in Georgia. Right now, Bob, are you there?
Yeah, how you doing?
Hey, doing well, Bob. How are you?
Fine.
Good. What's your point of view?
I just wanted to say, stepping back to the first subject. You know, when I was growing up, I was 13 years old in 1969, and my mom had to lock me in my bedroom to keep me from running away to go to Woodstock. And I loved, you know, all of them. Jimi Hendrix, you know, The Doors, you know, Led Zeppelin, all those. I loved them. And I, you know, I was in a lot of, you know, always doing drugs and stuff. Started doing drugs at a very early age, at 12 years old. And I can't, as a Christian now, I mean, I didn't get saved till I'm 61. I didn't get saved till I was 55.
Wow.
And I turned it around. I mean, in my mind, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away, and all things have become new. I love the new Christian music, but I'll tell you the truth, I can't listen to the old stuff. It brings back too many bad memories, and I don't understand how some people, I mean, I even know people in the ministry that, you know, are, you know, really into, you know, like I heard one pastor talking about how he loved, you know, Steve Miller Band and Hotel California. You couldn't have a song that's more satanic, I mean, than Hotel California. I mean, it's just straight up, you know, praise the devil, let's have a good time music. That's what it's, and I don't understand how you could be in both arenas.
Yeah, some of the fascinating research that's coming out, Bob, is we're finding that music actually triggers emotions because it's tied to memories, which is just fascinating because we've always kind of known that to be true. Whenever we hear a song, it kind of takes us back. So as you're hearing this music right now, it should be telling us it's taking us back to a commercial, and we'll be back right after this.
From PureFlix comes God's Not Dead, a light in darkness. Even in life's darkest valleys, a small flame can light the way toward healing and hope.
We are called to be a light in the darkness.
Starring David A.R. White and John Corbett.
God's Not Dead.
God's Not Dead, a light in darkness. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. In theaters March 30th. More information is available at godsnotdead.com.
Christians are called to have answers. Answers for those who doubt our faith and answers for those going through difficult times. Thanks to our Truth Team members, Point of View provides those answers. You can play a vital role in bringing truth to the pressing issues of our day and truth when life doesn't seem fair. Help shine a light in darkness by giving today. Call 800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net/team. Do not miss or minimize how much of a difference you can make. Take just a couple of minutes and join the Truth Team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View. I am Nick Pitts, your host for the Millennial Roundtable of this Point of View radio talk show. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable today in studio by Kerby Anderson and Brent Taylor. And we have been talking about Sweet Jesus ice cream and how there are individuals that are lifting up their voices and protesting, boycotting, and just voicing disagreement with the idea of taking the Lord's name in vain in order to be able to satisfy the hungers of their stomach. And so we have been talking about that and taking some phone calls on that particular issue. And so we'd love to hear from you. 800-351-1212. Again, 800-351-1212. You can jump over to Facebook, facebook.com/pointofviewradio to share your comment and question as well. And we'll get to that in a timely fashion as well, and potentially even over there. And so we're going to continue taking some phone calls, and we've got Karen in Canada right now. Karen, are you there?
Yeah.
Hey, Karen, how are you?
I'm pretty good.
It's so good to hear from you. What's your point of view?
Well, it really bothers me very much when I hear people using God's name in vain.
Mm-hmm.
And I let them know that I can't always, I don't always have the, I guess you'd say, the guts, but then God tells me, tell them how you feel. And some will listen, but some don't. And I just cannot believe how many Christians are doing that.
Yeah, Karen, you bring up a really great point in the sense that I think and again, it's not because I don't value the name of the Lord. I guess it's just because it's become so prevalent in my circles that I'm not as bothered by. I'm frustrated by it, but I'm not bothered by it. And maybe that's just an indictment on the circles and maybe some of my friends. But I think it brings up a great point that we've been talking about just at the roundtable right now. Because Brent, you were saying how you were troubled by it. But so I send out this little daily newsletter called the Daily Briefing. And I try to put 2 funny videos at the very end to help individuals be reminded that the world is not all bad. Like, everything's not always a controversy. Everything's not always bad. And oftentimes, some of those funny videos, they sneak by me, and there's the name of the Lord that's used in vain. And usually there's quite a few little email responses back asking why I would ever put something in there. And Brent, I guess maybe it's a generational thing. Maybe it's just a me thing that I've just really numb to it. But it's fascinating how these different generations view using the Lord's name in vain.
It's interesting because over the past, 50 years, 60 years, more than that now, I guess, you have this whole culture around labeling people. We've seen it particularly over the past few years about labeling people as Hitler. Mm-hmm. Somebody doesn't agree with us, their viewpoint, they're acting like Hitler or that kind of thing. And even politicians are called that at a point. And obviously people are saying, well, you shouldn't say that. That's taking an extreme to compare someone to Hitler. And yet to say things and to use the name of the Lord in a loose manner is considered to be not that big a deal anymore. And so it is I think for many people, it is maybe the culture, because I know with my own kids growing up in this culture today, they don't have that same feeling that I have. Mm-hmm. And I try to explain to them why they should, or why I feel that way, or why we don't say that. And there is just sometimes a look on their face like, okay, is Dad just being extreme here? But again, I mean, the scriptures talk about not using the Lord's name in an unworthy and a vain manner, and I just think we have to be careful of that. That's a coarseness, I think, that has happened in our culture, and sometimes if something is rough and coarse, you get used to it after a while, and I think we just have to be careful with that. And I don't want to be a person who sits around in judgment, because it's not something that is on my heart, the kind of person that I want to be, of just judging everybody. I'm just telling you that it rubs my heart in a way that gets my attention every time I hear it. There's hardly a time that goes by that I don't feel it, even when I hear it.
Oh, that's fascinating. I think there's a sense too, because I guess the explicit command, what we see is don't take the Lord's name in vain. But if we unpack it a little bit more, we understand that it's more than just the utterance of God's name in an ill-conceived manner. At the end of the day, it's acting in a way that's not befitting of the name of the Lord. Just like my dad would often tell me, remember your last name. You're going out as a representative of Pitt's family, right? The body part might be funny, but the name is not. There's worthiness to, there's honor to it. Don't dishonor the name. And at the very core of the text, and at the very core of the command that God gives us in Exodus 20 is, yes, there is a component that doesn't want to use his name in a way that's unbefitting saying it. But there's also the significance and the thrust of it is, don't act like the enemy. Don't act like you're from the family. Be exceedingly gracious. Be unconditionally loving. Be traditionally kind towards individuals. There's a words and there's a deeds to it as well.
I'm also thinking the context is important. You know, I worked in a machine shop, and I've worked to lay gas pipelines, and I've worked as a janitor, and you heard a lot of language there, and you almost came to expect it. About 2 weeks ago, I remember Nick Pitts being a little bit upset about what the president said about one of the broadcasters on television, because when the president says it, or if the same words you heard around the workers that I dug ditches with in the church or in the Oval Office, you're upset about that. So I think that's another aspect of that to consider. But that's the problem. You know, when, as Brent points out, we're starting to hear things in the church or in the media or from the president, which you unfortunately do hear from workers out there on a crew. You get upset, because as bad as it is when you hear it in a locker room or you hear it with ditch diggers or the rest, that is bad enough. But then when you hear it in offices and in the media and in movies, that's when
and
it really starts bothering you.
These kids that are like protesting right now, right?
Yes.
You got David Hogg. Like
he just cannot say more than 2 or 3 sentences without at least one or more profane words.
Yeah, he's
that
putting
just
words in his mouth that I wouldn't put in my hand. I mean, dear goodness, like it's just and we've become numb to it, right?
Yeah.
Like, why are we so numb to this? You've got to have a more expansive vocabulary to better articulate what you're going through, rather than these lazy words that lose the significance and weight of because you overuse them in any instance.
And what we see here, though, is that words matter.
Yeah.
Yes.
What people say matters. It matters what the president says. It matters what the pastor says. It matters what we say. And that's, I think, part of the reason why I get bothered by phrases that are used, because to me it matters. It's important to me. And again, I understand people come from different cultural understandings. I have taken groups to Israel, traveled in the Holy Land, and I have had guides that I've had to talk to and say to the guide, hey, I'd really prefer for you not to use the phrase that way, because that troubles our people. It's viewed as taking the Lord's name in vain. Well, the guide was just shocked by that. He just couldn't believe that, because he thought he was saying it in a respectful manner. So context does matter, but words matter, and we have to be aware of what we say.
Well said.
Let's keep on jumping over the phone lines. We've got Lynn in North Carolina right now. Lynn, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hey, Lynn.
Nick, thanks for taking my call, brother. I appreciate it. Kirby, think about this a minute. I'm going to take you back memory road. We talk about the using the Lord's name in vain, and being in the military like I was, you heard it every day, and you kind of get synthesized. But when you go back, you think when abortion, the prayer was taken out of the school, everything has happened to the church, and the church has sat back with their hands. I think the church in general has got completely apathetic to hearing the Lord's name, and they don't see it. But yet, if you go and work or live in an Islamic country, and you say, like you said, the same thing about
there would be a price to
faith,
pay, wouldn't there? Yes.
Yes, they'll set you on fire. They'll kill you. They'll rape your family. I mean, but we just think that we can just sit back and take it. And I'm afraid, from my position in employment, that we're in a situation that the Christians in the next 5 years are going to make a determination whether we're around or not, because we're just getting snowballed every time we turn around. And do I agree with the ice cream deal? I don't think it's a big deal, but we're on and off. We want to complain about this, and we don't want to complain about that, and we've got to take a stand, and we've got to stand by it and be consistent. That's the thing the church has not done, is been consistent over the last 30 years. And that's my point. Thank you, brother.
And he talks about the military. There was a time when the chaplains that were instituted by General George Washington, sitting with a historian here, that prohibited profanity in the military. And, of course, see how that changed dramatically as well.
And I think it's because our culture has changed so much.
Yes.
You know, now we expect these words, we expect things to be said. I remember talking to someone who was describing when the tapes came out of Nixon.
Yes.
And what was so shocking about it was to hear the President of the United States saying those words, because those were common words that were not to be used by people in leadership.
Yeah, and so
fortunately, no president now is doing that.
Yeah, we'll be. And so to use our former president John Adams, if you can't control your mouth, you need to sit at the kids' table. We'll be right back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. When the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit declined to review a decision of that court that said that the cross-shaped Bladensburg World War I Veterans Memorial is unconstitutional, not all the judges agreed. Chief Judge Gregory noted his dissent. He said, quote, "Nearly a century ago, Maryland citizens, out of deep respect and gratitude, took on the daunting task of erecting a monument to mirror the measure of individual devotion and sacrifice these heroes had so nobly advanced. The panel majority says their effort violates the Constitution the soldiers fought to defend. I, respectfully, think otherwise." Judge Niemeyer said with some exasperation, quote, "Until this action was filed by persons who claimed to be offended by the presence of the monument, no complaint had been made about its presence," unquote. But Judge Wilkinson was poetic in his dissent. He wrote, quote, "The dead cannot speak for themselves, but may the living hear their silence. This memorial and this cross have stood for almost one full century. Life and change flow by the small park in the form of impatient cars and trucks. That is disturbance enough," unquote. He concluded simply noting that the park in which the memorial stands, quote, "may not be Arlington National Cemetery, but it is the next thing to it. I would let the cross remain and let those honored rest in peace," unquote. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I am Nick Pitts. I am joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Kerby Anderson and Brent Taylor, who's the pastor at Church at the Fields. And we have been talking about using the Lord's name in vain, going all the way back to Sweet Jesus, this ice cream company out of Toronto that's making waves right now, and not the Rocky Road waves you would expect, nor the wedding cake waves, or even the Neapolitan waves, but rather just the name that they're using, as well as some of the logos that they're using on their ice cream, that's causing individuals to protest and individuals to lift up their voices in dissent against this, feeling as though it's heretical and blasphemous. And we've been talking, and we've been taking some of your phone calls about what are we to think of this? Are you of the mind that it's not really that big a deal? Are you more of the mind that there's weightiness to the name of the Lord? That's why it's in the Ten Commandments that we need to hold it heavily. we'd love to hear from you. 800-351-1212. And our phone calls are pretty packed right now, so you might have to leave a little voicemail or leave a little text message on Facebook. So facebook.com/pointofviewradio. Go right underneath there, leave a little comment or message, and we'll get to it eventually on the air. And so we're going to continue taking phone calls. And so we'll jump on over to Georgia, and we've got Becky on right now. Becky, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Hey, Becky. What's your point of view?
Yes, sir. Appreciate you guys. I believe, like a lot of the previous callers, that we've become calloused to what society is saying. Oh, it's no big deal, like you've mentioned. And I'm really proud of our daughters. We have a sophomore in college and a high school junior, and they're both very sensitive to that kind of thing. And I am as well, my husband as well. But we need to take a stand with it. And we need to say, look, we're not going to put up with that. And I'm of the camp that we need to really stand firm about what Scripture says about holding true to honoring the Lord's name and being that salt in the world. And the world right now doesn't seem to like salt very much anymore. So being salty is very difficult. But I really believe we need to uphold that and say, look, we're not going to put up with that kind of language and how you toss the Lord's name around and not show the respect that Scripture says that we need to show for Him.
Yeah, Becky, you bring up such a great point. There's so much life and there can be so much death in the words that we say, and I think the biblical narrative would even reverberate that, the understanding that our words carry a certain weight, right? Since we're made in the image of God, we're reminded of what God did, that He spoke the world into existence. It was the Word, Jesus, that went before us, and it says in Colossians 1, holds all things together and is before all things. And then to a large degree, we continue to see even Jesus is going to use our words to be able to draw men in order that they might be able to taste and see and to know that He is good.
When we talk about taking the Lord's name in vain, the word vain has to do with being worthless or empty, meaningless, that kind of thing. And I think the Scripture is teaching us that our relationship with God is something that is to be valued, and there's a need for reverence and awe. We talk frequently about how the fear of the Lord is no longer a topic. It's no longer something that people seem to discuss anymore, and yet it's all throughout Scripture. It's the beginning of knowledge. It's so important for us to recognize that our relationship with the Lord, one of my favorite hymns is What a Friend We Have in Jesus. I love that hymn, but He's not our buddy. He is a friend, and He's the friend of sinners, and we understand that, but He's not our buddy. There is a respect and an awe and a reverence that needs to be there, and I think that's the essence of what we're talking about with the name of the Lord. And I think that when people, when the occasion is right to speak up, I think the command obviously is for all people, but not all people know it or are following the Lord. So as believers, I think that's a step we can take. I'm not sure it's our job to go police everybody as much as it is to make sure that our hearts are in check, that our hearts are right, that our words are used with power, and that we don't take the name of the Lord as something that is inconsequential or common.
Yeah, and even Melissa on Facebook kind of echoed that. She said exactly, words do matter. And she says that we're given free choice and we need to guard our hearts by guarding what we let into our lives, relative to kind of the comment about really our words are just the overflow of our hearts from Matthew. And then we're called to be ambassadors, and Jesus said they'll know us by our fruits, and some of those fruits are the words of our mouth that come out. And just kind of reminded of what Paul says in Ephesians 4:29, right? To let your to watch your mouth to a large degree, and only let what come out what's pleasing, good, and is uplifting for the moment, bringing grace in that particular moment. And so let's jump on over to some more phone calls. We've got Laura in South Carolina right now. Laura, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hey, Laura, what's your point of view?
I didn't come in on the very beginning, so I didn't hear whether or not this company claimed to be Christians or not.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you know if they do?
No, they're not.
They're not. Okay. I know that there's a company. I'm in South Carolina, so in the southeast, there's a company called Sweet Frog. That's a yogurt company.
No, I know Sweet Frog well.
Right, and it stands for Fully Rely on God. It's an acronym.
Mm-hmm.
And anyhow, so I don't know if maybe they happened to be on vacation at some point and went to one and thought that they would capitalize on people knowing what Sweet Frog was. And so they think, well, they thought it was similar, and thought that, it would help get them some business, probably from Christians. If they're not Christians, maybe that's what they thought.
Yeah.
They made a big mistake if they did.
Yeah, I think, Laura, I think from the story based on the Religion News Service, which we've linked to over on our website, it seems as though they heard Sweet Jesus was just a common moniker that was used by them whenever something good happened or something exciting or surprising happened. They would say Sweet Jesus. And so I think one of their friends had a really great experience with some food product, and they said Sweet Jesus, and they were like, well, that would be a great type of ice cream. So we'll just make that, which is just a very interesting way to use the Lord's name. And we'll take one more phone call. We've got Larry here. Larry, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hey, Larry, we got about a minute left. What's your point of view?
Okay, great. They may have responded to Sweet Jesus and put that name on it, but you said that they put the cross on there upside down. That's a direct contradiction, so we know where they stand. I would rather be alone in my faith than stand with someone. I think our most common response should be when someone uses the Lord's name in vain or uses any swear word, was that necessary? There's only three answers: yes, no, and I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to be fully cognizant of the way Jesus is our example. Children learn from us. They learn from the example. Either become the example or they become the opposite. The question we need to answer within ourselves is, what example are we to them?
Yeah, that's such a great remark, Larry. Because at the end of the day, you're right. Like God won't be mocked, but we Christians have been known to get offended every once in a while. And if all publicity is good publicity, then this ice cream company ordered a sundae of publicity with a cherry on top. I disagree with the name, but I'm more saddened by the prospect that the owners probably don't know the sweetness of Jesus. And to take the name of God in vain is more than simply uttering it, but rather living in such a way that dishonors him and fails to reflect his character. God's perfect patience waits for us when we don't make time for him. His unconditional love doesn't hold grudges and wants to bear our burdens, and his extravagant grace celebrates in moments of sweetness and heals in times of sorrow. Jesus is sweeter than ice cream, and I hope the people that go to Sweet Jesus will enjoy the ice cream, but taste and see and know that the Lord is good. So thank you so much for joining us on this Wednesday edition of Point of View. Kirby, thank you so much.
If they want to hear where that is or read where that is, they can get that at the Daily Briefing, right?
Jump on over to thebriefing.net, and would be happy to allow you to let me send you an email every morning. And so, Brent, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and happy birthday again to my son, Braden. He's 15 today.
Happy birthday, Braden.
Pretty good.
Reba McIntyre, and we will see you back here tomorrow.
From Affirm Films, the studio that brought you Risen and War Room, comes Paul, Apostle of Christ. Two men challenged an empire in order to live out the gospel of Jesus Christ and spread their message to the world.
Where sin abounds, grace abounds more.
Starring Jim Caviezel. Paul, Apostle of Christ. Rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. Now playing. More information is available at paulmovie.com.
Few of us get the chance to really make a difference, but today you have an opportunity. The question is whether you will seize it. Becoming a Truth Team partner with Point of View magnifies your impact in this generation and perhaps for many to come. When you stop what you're doing and call us or give online, you invest in hard work that has changed lives and communities for 45 years. Grab this opportunity. Call 800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net/team. Don't let this opportunity pass by. Join the team and make a difference. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.